In the spring of 2003, morning coffee in Springfield was a popular spot among locals. The small establishment with its wooden furniture and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee attracted people of all ages. Linda Marshall, a woman of average height with neatly styled brown hair, came here almost every evening. She worked as an accountant for a local insurance company and led a solitary life. Her co-workers described Linda as someone who preferred to keep a low profile. She rarely made conversation, but she felt comfortable in the cafe, sitting at her favorite table by the window. Jake Richardson, on the other hand, was the life of the party. Young, energetic, with short blonde hair and an open smile, he found it easy to connect with customers. Jake had moved to Springfield 2 years earlier after dropping out of college and had taken a job at the cafe to make ends meet. His charisma and conversational skills made him a favorite with customers, especially older ladies, who left generous tips. Linda, however, never talked to him longer than it took to order. One April evening, Linda was sitting at her table, engrossed in a book. As usual, Jake came over to take her order. This time, Linda suddenly looked up and lingered on the young waiter. She noticed how he smiled as he handed her the menu, and for the first time, she answered him with more than a monosyllable. The conversation began with banal phrases about the weather, but gradually moved on to more personal topics. Jake told her that he dreamed of starting his own business, and Linda shared that she liked to read detective stories. That evening was the first time Linda stayed in the cafe longer than usual. Over the next few weeks, Linda began coming to the cafe more often, choosing shifts when Jake worked. She began ordering more than just coffee, and each time she tried to strike up a conversation with him. Jake, accustomed to the attention of customers, did not attach much importance to this. He was polite, joked, and willing to engage in conversation. Linda, however, began to develop feelings for him, which soon grew into something more than just a crush. Their communication became more and more personal. One evening, when the cafe was closing, Linda invited Jake to have coffee together after his shift. He accepted, considering it a friendly gesture. They spent the evening talking about life, dreams, and plans. Linda felt a connection developing between them, and her interest in Jake grew stronger. She began to notice details: the way he fixed his hair, the way he laughed, the way he moved. These little things increased her attraction. In early May, their relationship took a new level. After another shift, Jake agreed to come to Linda's house to continue the conversation. They spent the night together, and for Linda, this was confirmation that there was something serious between them. Jake, however, took it as a one-time event. He was not looking for a serious relationship, but he did not want to offend Linda, so he continued to be polite and friendly with her. Linda began texting Jake more often, calling him, and looking for excuses to meet him. She began showing up at the coffee shop even on days he wasn't working, asking his co-workers about his schedule. Jake, although he noticed her increased attention, didn't see anything alarming in it. He assumed that Linda was just a lonely woman who enjoyed his company. However, her behavior gradually began to change, and soon she began to show signs of obsession. By the end of May, Linda was no longer just coming to the cafe, but was also keeping an eye on Jake outside of work. She began to notice who he was hanging out with, where he went after his shift, and even wrote down his schedule. She knew when he went to the gym, where he parked his car, and who he spent time with. Linda began to imagine a future together, although Jake gave her no reason to think that their relationship was serious. Her feelings, which began as an innocent crush, were gradually turning into an obsession that was drawing her deeper and deeper. By the summer of 2003, Linda Marshall's behavior began to change noticeably. If before she was just a frequent visitor to the cafe, now her visits became systematic. She showed up during the hours when Jake Richardson was on shift and stayed until closing, watching him from her table. Linda began asking questions of his colleagues, trying to find out details of his personal life, who his friends were, where he spent his weekends, whether he had a girlfriend. Jake's colleagues, not suspecting anything strange, willingly shared information, considering Linda simply a curious client. Linda began following Jake outside of work. She would watch him leave the cafe, get into his old blue Honda, and drive home. Sometimes she would follow him in her car, keeping a distance so as not to be seen. She learned where he lived, a small apartment building about 10 minutes drive from the cafe. Linda began parking near his house, watching when he came in or left. She would record the times he turned on the lights in his apartment, and even take pictures of his car to make sure he hadn't gone anywhere. Her obsession manifested itself in other small ways, too. Linda began collecting mementos of Jake. She kept a napkin on which he had once written her a humorous note, and a receipt from a cafe where he had waited on her. She created a folder on her computer where she kept secret photos of Jake and notes on his habits. Linda studied his social media profiles, which were just beginning to gain popularity in 2003, and analyzed every message he sent, trying to figure out who he was communicating with. Jake, in turn, began to notice strange behavior in Linda. She called him several times a day, leaving long messages asking him to meet up, even if he didn't answer. One day, when he left the gym, he noticed Linda sitting in her car nearby. She quickly turned away, pretending to read something on her phone, but Jake became suspicious. He began to feel uncomfortable, but didn't pay much attention to it, attributing it to his paranoia. Jake decided to reduce his communication with Linda, answering her messages less often and avoiding long conversations in cafes. Linda took this as a personal affront. She began to suspect that Jake was seeing someone else, although she had no evidence. Her imagination conjured up scenes of him spending time with other women, and this only increased her obsession. She began showing up at his house more often, sometimes even at night, just to make sure he was there. One such evening, she noticed Jake leaving his apartment with a young man she did not know. They were laughing and heading toward Jake's car. Linda assumed he was a friend, but her mind was already filled with suspicion. In June, Linda began to take more action. She sent Jake a letter confessing her feelings and asking him to be with her. The letter was long, emotional, and hinted at their future together. Jake felt even more awkward after reading it. He responded politely but firmly, explaining that he was not looking for a serious relationship. This letter was a turning point, after which Linda began to act even more decisively. She began calling him more often, sometimes leaving voicemails in which she sounded pleading and then exasperated. Jake began to ignore most of her calls, which only added fuel to the fire. Linda began looking for ways to get closer to Jake. She learned that he sometimes visited a local bar with friends on Friday nights. She began showing up, sitting in the far corner and watching him. Jake was unaware of her presence, but Linda recorded his every move, who he talked to, how long he stayed, what time he left. She began to suspect that he was romantically involved with one of the girls he had talked to at the bar one day. It was just an acquaintance, but for Linda it became further evidence of his betrayal. Her actions became more and more obsessive. Linda began sending Jake gifts, books she knew he liked, or small souvenirs that she left at his door. She signed them anonymously, but Jake could guess who they were from. He tried to talk to Linda to explain that he did not want to continue their communication, but each time she changed the subject, pretending not to understand his hints. Her behavior became more and more unpredictable, and Jake began discussing the situation with his friends, asking what he should do. They advised him to be careful, but no one expected how far this story would go. By July 2003, Linda Marshall's obsession with Jake Richardson had reached a new level. Her actions were becoming more brazen and her behavior less controlled. She was no longer just watching Jake from afar. Linda had begun to take steps that directly interfered with his life. She learned his work schedule and began showing up at places where he spent time, even if it was just casual meetings with friends. She followed him to the grocery store, to the gym, and even to the parking lot of his apartment building. Jake began to notice her presence more often, and it was causing him increasing anxiety. One evening, while driving home, Jake found a note on his car, taped under the windshield wiper. It read, "You can't ignore me forever." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting and tone pointed to Linda. Jake began to suspect that her behavior was more than just a crush. He decided to confront her directly and asked to meet in a neutral place to discuss the situation. Linda agreed, but instead of listening to him, she began to talk about her feelings, claiming that they were made for each other. Jake made it clear that he did not share her feelings and wanted to end all communication. Linda outwardly accepted his words, but her behavior after this meeting only became more insistent. Linda began calling Jake from unknown numbers, using public phones or temporary SIM cards. She left messages, sometimes pleading with him to reconsider, sometimes accusing him of indifference. Jake saved the messages but didn't know how to respond. He turned to a friend who worked for the local police for advice. The friend suggested that he document all the times Linda showed up uninvited and perhaps file a harassment report. Jake, however, was reluctant to pursue formal complaints, hoping that Linda would stop her actions on her own. Meanwhile, Linda began to interfere with Jake's social circle. She learned the names of his friends through social media and began messaging them, posing as someone Jake knew. In these messages, she asked about his life, trying to find out who he spent his time with. One of Jake's friends, Kevin, told him about strange messages from a woman who called herself Linda. This was the last straw for Jake. He decided to ignore Linda completely, blocking her number and avoiding any contact. Linda, feeling that she was losing control of the situation, began to act even more aggressively. She began showing up at Jake's house almost every night, sometimes just standing under his windows. She began sending him letters, which were delivered by couriers so that he could not ignore them. In these letters, she described her fantasies about their life together, but the tone became increasingly threatening. In one letter, she wrote, "If you're not with me, you're not with anyone." Jake began to keep these letters, realizing that they might be needed as evidence. In early August, Linda made a move that would change the course of events forever. She learned that Jake was planning a weekend getaway to a lake with friends. She decided to follow him, renting a car to remain unnoticed. For 2 days, she watched Jake and his friends from afar, taking photos and recording who he talked to. When she saw Jake talking to a young woman in their group, her jealousy reached its peak. She convinced herself that this woman was the reason he had rejected her. Back home, Linda began planning her next steps. She bought a small notebook and began writing down everything about Jake, his schedule, his habits, the places he had been. She also began researching how to influence someone who did not reciprocate her feelings. Her searches on the internet led her to forums that discussed manipulation and control. Linda began to think that she could force Jake to be with her if she created a situation in which he had no choice. By this point, Linda's behavior had become noticeable not only to Jake but also to those around him. Co-workers at the cafe began to notice that she was showing up too often and acting strangely. One of them reported to the manager that Linda had been asking questions about Jake's personal life, which had caused concern. The manager spoke to Jake, offering to temporarily transfer him to another shift to avoid contact with Linda. Jake agreed, but this only made Linda more determined. She began calling the cafe to find out when Jake worked, and even tried to befriend other employees to gain access to his schedule. By the end of August 2003, Linda Marshall's behavior had become openly threatening. Her obsession with Jake Richardson had escalated into actions that could no longer be ignored. Jake, feeling the pressure mounting, began taking steps to protect himself. He installed a call recording app on his phone and saved all messages from Linda, realizing the situation was becoming dangerous. He also informed a friend at the police about her behavior, providing him with call records and letters. The officer advised him to apply for a temporary restraining order, but Jake was still hesitant, hoping that Linda would back off on her own. Linda, however, was not going to stop. She began taking more drastic steps to get Jake's attention. One night, she left a box of personal items outside his door, a photograph of them together during one of their meetings, and a letter demanding an explanation for why he was avoiding her. The letter was handwritten, with shaky letters, and contained the phrase, "You can't just walk away from this." Jake, upon discovering the box, decided it was time to take action. He filed a police report detailing the stalking incidents and obtained a temporary restraining order, preventing Linda from approaching or contacting him. The warrant, however, only angered Linda. She took it as a personal insult and began looking for ways to circumvent the ban. She stopped showing up at Jake's house, but continued to follow him through acquaintances. Linda contacted one of his co-workers, posing as an old friend, and tried to find out where Jake was spending his time. The co-worker, suspicious, reported it to Jake, who immediately passed the information on to the police. The police warned Linda of the consequences of violating the warrant, but she denied any involvement in any of the actions. In early September, Linda took more drastic measures. She began spreading rumors about Jake among his acquaintances, claiming that he had cheated on her and behaved inappropriately. These rumors reached his friends, who began asking questions. Jake was forced to explain the situation, which made him feel awkward and irritated. He began avoiding places where he might accidentally run into Linda, and even considered changing jobs to cut off contact completely. One evening, while returning home, Jake noticed that his apartment had been broken into. The door lock had been damaged and some of the items inside had been turned over. Nothing of value was missing, but there was a note on the table with a single word, "Why?" Jake immediately called the police, who recorded the break-in. Although there was no direct evidence pointing to Linda, Jake was certain that she was the culprit. The police increased surveillance on Linda, but she was careful to avoid any obvious violations. Linda, meanwhile, began to lose control of her emotions. She spent hours rereading Jake's old messages and looking at his photos. Her notes became increasingly erratic, with phrases like, "He needs to understand," and "I can't lose him." She began to plan the final move to get Jake to pay attention to her. Linda decided that the only way to get it was to create a situation in which he couldn't ignore her. In mid-September, Linda learned that Jake was going to a party thrown by his friends. She decided that this was her last chance. She hatched a plan that she believed would make Jake come back to her. Linda began collecting items she thought she would need to carry out her plan, including things she kept as reminders of Jake. Her actions became increasingly unpredictable, and she no longer considered the consequences. By the end of September 2003, the situation between Linda Marshall and Jake Richardson had reached a breaking point. Linda, ignoring the restraining order, continued to look for ways to get closer to Jake. Her obsession had grown into the belief that only drastic action would win his attention back. She learned of a party Jake was planning to attend and decided to seize the opportunity. Linda prepared a bag of things she believed would help her achieve her goal and headed to the party location, the home of one of Jake's friends. The party was on a Friday night. Jake was there with a few friends, enjoying the music and conversation. He was trying to take his mind off the last few months that had been marred by Linda's stalking. Around midnight, he went out into the backyard to answer the phone. At that moment, Linda, who had been quietly watching the house from a car parked nearby, decided to act. She approached the house, holding an object in her hand that was later found by the police. Jake, having finished the conversation, noticed Linda standing in the shadows by the fence. He recognized her silhouette and tried to return to the house, but Linda called out to him. She began to speak quickly, her voice trembling with emotion. She accused Jake of ruining her life and demanded that he admit his feelings. Jake tried to calm her down, but Linda became increasingly aggressive. At some point, the situation got out of control, and Linda, in a fit of despair, committed an act that led to irreversible consequences. Jake's friends, hearing the noise, ran into the backyard. They called the police and an ambulance, but it was too late. Linda, realizing what had happened, tried to escape, but was detained near the house. The police seized the items she had brought with her and began an investigation. During the search of her car and apartment, they found notes, photographs, and other evidence confirming her long-term stalking of Jake. Linda was arrested and brought to trial. Her lawyers tried to portray her actions as the result of an emotional breakdown caused by loneliness and psychological problems, but the evidence was too strong. The trial lasted several months, and Linda was eventually found guilty. Her conviction made local news, sparking a debate about how far human obsession can go.